So, hello, today we are joined by Dr. Victoria Mattingly. Victoria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I have my PhD in organizational psychology, meaning I was trained on using science and data to improve the human experience in the workplace. I'm a published author. My first book, Inclusalytics, has been sold around the world, helping diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders take a more data-driven approach to their work. And my second book, coming out in August of 2025, so maybe it's already out, depending when you're listening to this podcast, is called Act Like an Ally, Work with an Ally, all about allyship being a two-sided relationship between an ally and the individual they're trying to serve. I'm also a keynote speaker. I've spoken at a number of organizations, conferences, associations, educational institutions, and I do adjunct teaching as well. I'm a professor here at a local university in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the US.
Okay, sounds really interesting. You've got lots of experience there. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about the work that you've been doing around inclusion?
Absolutely. So I started on my workplace inclusion journey towards the end of my PhD training. My dissertation was on male executive allyship and how male executives can be better allies to women in the workplace to help advance women in leadership goals. I did find that you can train male leaders to exhibit allyship behaviors and help develop women in organizations. So that's really what brought me into the workplace inclusion space, allyship particularly. I've since helped over 100 organizations build more inclusive cultures. That could look like doing a cultural assessment to understand how various groups feel like they're being valued, respected, seen, and heard within an organization, identifying low scoring groups, and then giving focus groups and trying to understand, they're having that experience to help come up with data driven solutions for that. Sometimes it looks like training, so leadership development, executive training, workforce trainings, and then just the last 6 months or so, I've really pivoted to keynotes just because, DEI or inclusion, whatever you want to call it, really is a culture change effort. And even though the measurement and the consulting is very important, we also need to be changing hearts and minds. And so I have a lot of experiences, whether working with clients or personal experiences to share. And I've been really loving the keynote circuit so far.
Sorry, it all cut out there. I don't know if you want to repeat that because I don't know if it worked. I didn't pick up any of that. You just froze.
Where did it freeze at?
Um, you are talking about the culture change.
Okay. Um, So I've done a lot of consulting and measurement work when it comes to workplace inclusion. And then recently I have dug more into keynotes because DEI done right truly is a culture change initiative. And we need to not only do the measurement and the consulting and the systems change, but we also need to be changing hearts and minds, getting people educated, getting people motivated, changing perspectives around how we should treat each other in the workplace, especially those from marginalized and underrepresented groups.
Yeah. So do you think that like all people within those groups are likely to be marginalized, or do you think some people within those groups aren't? Does that make sense? Because I think when you group people together, sometimes they're not all the same.
So everyone has a unique individual experience. And there are certainly, if you think about it from a leadership perspective, there are certainly women CEOs, people of color CEOs, LGBTQ political leaders, right? So there's always these exceptions that, people do make it to the top. They're all super successful and they might also belong to a marginalized group. But when we look at it at the population level, at that high level group level, we don't see equity, right? So just taking gender as an example. So we should see across all leadership levels, we should have about 49% women, 49% men, and about 2% non-binary at any leadership level. And that's simply just not what we're seeing. The higher up in leadership, the less representation we have. And so when it comes to workplace inclusion and DEI, we're really trying to solve that population level problem, even though there might be individuals that don't necessarily need that extra help and support because they've succeeded on their own.
And when you include some groups, I guess you are excluding other groups by, like, because you can't include everybody all the time.
So this is where I think the beauty of allyship really takes hold. So allyship is an ongoing relationship between an ally and a partner, and that's the individual that they're trying to serve. So the person from the underrepresented or marginalized group. And so it really invites in people that have traditionally felt left out by DEI initiatives. So men, white people, straight people, able-bodied individuals, people that don't feel like DEI has anything to do with them. It's just not true. We all have a role to play, whether it's as an ally, as a partner. And so I really feel like allyship is the solution to this exclusionary, byproduct of DEI. I also think about employee resource groups. That's a big area of DEI. So these groups that exist within organizations that are based on identity or affinity. A lot of these groups are all inclusive. It's if it's a Black ERG, white allies are welcome. If it's an LGBTQ ERG, straight allies are welcome, right? And so I'm seeing a lot more inclusion of these groups that were left out, I think, over the last few years.
Right. So, yeah, for me, I'm getting a little bit, I don't know, worn down by all these boxes. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And I've stopped filling them in because it just feels like it's everywhere. They want you to tick a box and they want to sort of get more and more information. And I think sometimes you miss things because you're trying to come up with all these different boxes. You might miss something.
Yeah, so I think gender is a really great example of that. So traditionally, it was a male box or a female box that you checked, but the more progressive organizations, and I'm thinking about like job applications particularly, I'm seeing way more options for gender. So finally starting to catch up with the fluidity of gender. Gen Z particularly, has a lot of non-binary individuals. And so being able to have, as you said, the right boxes to check, I feel like some organizations are catching up more quickly with that compared to others. Also, when it comes to race and ethnicity, what I see often is that you can check as many boxes as you need to because there's a lot more multiracial individuals that might be, that have multiple races, in their heritage. So I'm seeing slowly solutions to some of those boxes issues, but what gets measured gets done, and we need to know the demographics of the individuals that we're hiring, that are working within our organizations, that are leaving organizations, so we can start understanding and then tackling those systemic issues when it comes to certain groups.
I'm not convinced that boxes are the way forward, especially like with like sex and gender. Like the more boxes you have there, there's only two sexes, and like I don't understand what this non-binary stuff is and this gender stuff. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, gender's a lot more fluid than we've been socialized to believe. In some cultures, I'm thinking about Thailand, there's a lot of gender fluidity between male and female. And that you know, concept is starting to take hold in a lot of other countries as well. And as I mentioned, younger generations, I'd love to pull up a stat to see, how many identify as non-binary. And I don't think non-binary means like I'm neither. I think it really means I have qualities of both, and if you think about masculinity and femininity, not male and female, but masculinity and femininity, we all hold various traits that might be considered masculine or feminine. And women on average tend to hold more feminine traits. Men on average tend to hold more masculine traits, but this is a distribution. And so there's always going to be people on the outskirts. There's always going to be overlap. I myself am cisgender, meaning I was born female and I present
You
myself as
see, I
female
really
now.
hate that term. I really don't like it.
Why don't you like
Because I'm
it?
not a subset of me sex. I'm just not. I'm a woman.
But it's a way of differentiating people who were born the gender that they express,
Everybody's born one sex or the other.
but some of them, they don't express that gender when they grow up.
But that's just a stereotype.
But what about
They're
transgender
expressing,
people?
well, you can't change sex.
But what about transgender people? Do
You
you
can't
not?
change sex.
But what about transgender people? Like they're living it. They're living.
They're
They
people, but
did.
they don't change sex.
They changed their gender though.
Well,
Sex and
what is
gender
that
aren't the
though?
same thing. So sex is biological. Sex is anatomical. Gender is how you express your masculinity or your femininity. And we're at a point in society where it's becoming more accepted for people who do not feel like their gender matches their
See,
sex.
I grew up in the 80s and men wore makeup and grew their hair, but they didn't need to tick a box to say they were different.
Because society wasn't open to it then.
It
Society is
was.
different now. It's
There
different
was
now.
all sorts of pop stars and they were all on the telly. They were all on Top of the Pops when I was growing up.
Yeah, but a lot of like gender dysmorphia, a lot of people don't feel like they are themselves in the sex that they were born. And I think it's good that we live in a world that people can make those transitions to live more authentically as who they are.
Like what do you mean by transitions?
So making the transition from the sex you were born to the gender that you truly feel like you are.
So you're changing from a sex to a gender.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So say you're born as a woman, right? You're born as a female, but throughout your childhood, maybe adolescence, maybe early adulthood, you realize I don't fit in this body.
So you
I'm
have an
I'm a man.
operation,
Not necessarily. A lot of women who transition to men, they do have mastectomies.
but you can't transition to be a man because you're a woman. If you're a woman, you're always a woman.
If you're a woman who transitions to a man, you are now a man.
No, you can't change your sex.
You can't change your sex, but you can change your gender.
Well, how do you change your sex into a gender? I don't understand.
So sex is anatomical, sex
Yeah,
is
so you
biological, and gender is how you express your masculinity and your femininity.
through drugs and
Or through how you
operations.
dress, through surgery, through name changes. There's a lot of different ways you can express your gender. It doesn't have to necessarily be surgery. But a lot of women to male trans people do have what they call top surgery, which is removing the breast through mastectomy.
That's
That's pretty common.
horrific. That's a horrific thing to do to a healthy body.
But without having a healthy brain, it's not going to serve you well in life. And it makes them feel as though they're more aligned with who they feel they are as an individual.
But so they don't feel like they are the sex that they are. But so it doesn't matter what body they have, but changing their body helps them feel more themselves. It doesn't make sense.
I think it'd be hard to understand, coming from a cisgender perspective because we're lucky.
I'm a woman. I'm not
I'm a woman
cisgender.
too. I'm a
I'm
woman.
not cisgender.
I'm a woman. I was born a woman. I am a woman now. So I personally can't fathom, making a major change to my body, but I have a lot of understanding and empathy for those who feel that way. And think about something like liposuction or plastic surgery. People do that to feel
I
like they're
don't think they
more,
should.
well, they do it though, right? And people have the
We
right
don't
to
tick a
do that.
box to say I've had plastic surgery. I've had liposuction though, do we? Treat me differently at work because I've had liposuction.
But you will get treated differently because research shows that people who are more fit and more attractive have better interactions and better workplace
But you're
outcomes
not
compared to those
necessarily
that
more
don't.
attractive just because you've had that done.
You could be though. You could be.
Yeah, all of that stuff, it's just think it's really um harmful to society, harmful to children, because all this stuff's in schools.
Do you know anyone in do you know anyone who is trans?
I've known lots of people who said they were trans. Yes.
And getting to know them and their experience, so that's not convincing that it's a healthy decision for them?
No,
No, that's a shame.
it's not a healthy decision.
Shame. I am not personally a, trans activist by any means. I do have some trans friends and some non-binary friends, but I do believe that as long as what we're doing with ourselves doesn't cause harm to others, we should be allowed to express ourselves however we feel most authentic. And that's really what inclusion is all about. That's what
Well, this is the
authenticity is
thing,
all
though,
about.
that there's a lot of trans activists who are pushing for men to use women's spaces, and that's harmful for women. And the LGBTQ, whatever, plus all the extra letters, is actually harming women because some of the men who decide they're women, they have a fetish and they push women, like they end up abandoning their families, and it's quite abusive.
I personally have never heard about stories like that.
Yeah, so trans widows, you need to look it up. So we've got all this DEI in workplaces, and we are actually harming people who've been on the other side of this. So when someone comes out as trans, everybody gives them the attention. But what about the wife who's left behind? What about the children who are left behind? Are they supposed to just go along with this man who now says he wants to wear women's underwear?
I mean, that scenario applies to any major life change a spouse would make. I think about midlife crises, I think about affairs, I think about people just growing apart. Families separate and relationships break down. Turning trans might be
There's a
one
lot of abuse
reason,
in
but
those
there's
relationships.
I'd like to see the data on that. I feel like, especially here in the States, the trans community has been very much villainized, and I don't think it's justified. People are entitled to their opinions, but trans people deserve the same rights and respect that any individual
Well, the
does.
thing is, though, they seem to want more rights than everybody else.
I think they just want the same rights as everyone
Well, what
else.
rights do they want, though? Because I haven't been able to get anybody to say.
Rights to medical care, rights to employment, rights to just exist. It's not a protected group here in the States. Individuals get discriminated against. There's a lot of violence against trans women, particularly.
I don't think that the stats back that up, actually.
I think they do, but I
I
don't have them
don't.
handy
It's
right
I
now.
think they focused on a particular group of trans women. So these men were in sex work. That's where the figures were coming from.
I just think we all deserve the right to express ourselves the way we feel most authentic.
Well, yeah, that's fine until it like it goes into other people's rights.
That's the thing, we all have, it goes both ways. So we all have the freedom to have our own beliefs. And, I agree, like we shouldn't, if it's harmful to others, if there's harm and that being enacted on others, then that needs to be corrected. But all the cases, especially I'm talking about the workplace, I'm an organizational psychologist, so that's really the context that I operate in. There is a lot of discrimination and issues when it comes to the trans population. So those need to be addressed.
I actually think that women have been pushed out in favour of trans.
But the trans population is so small. Women make up 49% of the
Yeah, but
world.
they're intruding on women's spaces, women's sports. They're pushing women out of their own sports categories. In the Olympics last year, we had men punching women in the face.
That was a woman. That
It
was not a man.
wasn't.
That was not a
It
man.
was a man.
That was false. That was false
No,
information.
it wasn't. It was
She
a
just
man.
presented very masculine.
No, it was a man. It was a man punching a woman in the face. And then you've got Leah Thomas, who competed against Riley Gaines in the swimming. That was in America.
Yeah, so there
Yeah, he
are
was a
these
man.
instances where we do need to figure out what sports will look like with more trans individuals entering the sports arena.
Well, that's why we need to be clear about sex. So gender isn't a thing. It's sex that's important.
And maybe that will be the conclusion that ends up happening, but I think it's still being sorted out. I personally don't have a strong view one way or another when it comes to the sports aspect, but I do know these are very small use cases. I think I read
But
here
it
in the
affects
States, there's like,
all the women. If you let one man into a woman's toilet, for example, that's no longer a woman's space. So women have lost their rights.
I disagree. We have private stalls in women's bathrooms. It's no one's business what goes on in a private stall. And there's very little data on women being violated by trans
Yeah, there
individuals
is.
in the restroom.
There's whole websites,
But is it
actually.
backed up by actual
Yes, it's
valid data?
actually from newspaper articles, and yes, women have done research on this.
See that data.
So,
Once again, I'm not a trans activist. I just believe we all have the right to express ourselves the way that we feel is our authentic
yeah,
individual.
I think that because they've introduced all these different boxes, it's actually skewing the actual data that we need. And sex is important.
Sex is important, but gender is important as well, and they're not
Well,
the same thing.
I don't think it is, and I think gender is actually causing a problem in the statistics that we're collecting about, for example, like rape crimes and violent crimes, because men are being recorded as female when they're not. And in the UK, I'm not sure if the law's the same in America, but in the UK, women aren't actually able to commit rape because the definition of rape involves using a penis. But now we have court cases where women are being told they have to use she, her pronouns for men who've raped them in court. This has actually happened.
That sounds like there needs to be an update
And
to
there's
that
a
law.
so there's a problem there because women are being re-traumatized.
That's understandable, and I think there needs to be an update to that law to correct for the current state of events, which at the end of the day, the world has trans people and the world has non-binary people, and it's going to be more and more as the younger generations grow up into adults, and so the
Because
laws need to
they're being
change.
groomed at school
I don't think they're being
into
groomed.
confusion. The numbers have gone through the roof.
There's no grooming happening.
Yeah,
It's
there
just
is.
education.
There
Yeah.
is, unfortunately, in schools. They've got books and they've got activists going in and grooming children.
I think that's a narrative that's being pushed really hard from an anti-trans agenda that could be really damaging and harmful, especially to kids that
Well,
are
the trans
themselves.
agenda is harmful to children and women.
I disagree. I think the trans agenda is just to allow these people
I
to
think
exist in
there's
the
some
world.
very nasty people behind it, and there's some vulnerable people who've been caught up in that as well.
If we're going to talk about groups of nasty people, here in the US, the number one group that enacts violence, that murders others, that commits rape crimes are white straight men. So if there's one group that we need to be better understanding and creating more laws about and understanding from a gender, racial, sexual orientation perspective, it should be white straight men, not trans, this tiny little population of people that just want to exist in this world.
The thing is, though, when you've got that happening, men will exploit any loophole to get access to women and women's spaces, and that's the issue with trans.
Trans people are not dressing up as women to get into women's spaces to then hurt
Yeah, they
women.
are.
No, they aren't.
Yeah,
They
they
really
are.
aren't.
Men are doing that because you can't tell the difference between a man and a trans woman. There's no difference. They're all men.
Yeah, I think this is a really dangerous narrative that's villainizing a population that is highly susceptible to violence and discrimination.
It's true.
See the data on that.
So is it just LGBTQ plus that you are looking at, or are there other groups as well?
Well, workplace inclusion is encompassing of so many different groups. So there's gender, there's race and ethnicity, there's veterans, there's caregivers, there's those with disabilities, whether those are visible or invisible disabilities. There's so many different identity groups that are looked at and addressed when it comes to workplace inclusion.
Yeah, I think often that the focus is put on the LGBTQ plus whatever, rather than focusing on accessibility and disability and spending money on that.
Yeah,
Because
it's
if
really
it's
gonna
sorry, I was just going to say if it's accessible for someone who's disabled, it's accessible for everyone.
exactly, that's inclusive design. And it really is up to each individual organization and institution as to where they focus their DEI efforts. So some companies do have huge accessibility, ableness initiatives. Others, for a while after George Floyd here in the US was murdered, the focus was really on the Black population. That created the narrative that DEI just means white versus Black, which is not true. It is an important population here in the States, but it's not the only one that's addressed by DEI issues.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we can do about um like race discrimination because as far as I can tell, nobody in well, certainly in the UK, I don't see open discrimination at all. So if there is discrimination, it's very subtle and it's hard to detect.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue of our current, state and time. Discrimination used to be a lot more blatant and explicit and, racial slurs and, just straight up telling people you're not getting this job because you belong to this group. It is a lot more subtle nowadays, and it takes a lot more to demonstrate it and to prove it, but that does not mean it's still not worth pursuing, and there's, at least in the States, institutions and policies and laws in place to protect certain groups from discrimination in the workplace, and those still hold to this day.
So what sort of things would you look at?
So one example would be, you're up for a promotion and you would look at what qualifications do the candidates have, and say you're a member of a marginalized group, but you have more qualifications than, say, the white straight male on the candidate list, and then he gets the job over you, right? And so to be able to document, I have X more years of education, X more years of experience, I exhibit all these skills and traits and attributes that this person doesn't, and yet they still got the job. So there needs to be that data collection piece, that documentation piece, but really being able to demonstrate I was the more qualified person for the job. And there's no other reason I wouldn't have got this position if it wasn't for the fact I belong to this certain group.
Yeah, do you think that's quite common then? Have you seen examples of that actually happening?
For sure, there's discrimination cases all the time here in the States. It
Okay, so
actually
what?
goes the other way around too. A recent case just happened where a straight woman was bypassed for a job, a promotion at her organization, and her boss was LGBTQ. The other candidates were LGBTQ, and she was more qualified and she didn't get the role. And so
Yeah,
she filed a lawsuit and she won.
yeah.
DEI, it benefits all of us. It
Mm,
doesn't say you have to be straight or LGBTQ. What it says is that you cannot be discriminated against because of your sexual orientation. And in this case, she was discriminated against because she was straight. So it does go both ways.
yeah, I've been for jobs before, but and didn't get the job because it was for like a BAME kind of, it was aimed at, the whole organization was aimed at BAME, and I could have done the job, but I think someone who was BAME got the job, and I think that's fair enough. Probably they would have had more sort of experience of that culture than I did. So sometimes it is okay to do that. Yeah. So tell us about your books then. You've
Yeah.
got a couple of books.
Yes. So my first book was Inclusalytics, right there, all about data-driven DEI. So I'm an organizational psychologist. bringing these methodologies into the DEI space. So, how do we define these terms so they're clear and we're able to operationalize them? How do we measure various aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace? How do we make good surveys, conduct good focus groups? So, it really just covers how does bring more data into DEI work. My forthcoming book comes out in August, and it's called Act Like an Ally, Work with an Ally. And it's actually two books in one. So you would pick it up and it would look like this. And then you flip it over and it's the other book. And so the books reference each other. So in the Work with an Ally book, I'm talking to the partners, so the individuals that benefit from allyship. And I'll say, hey, I'm telling allies on page A42, be courageous. So give them something courageous to do. And then I want the person reading this side of the book to then flip it over and be like, what are they saying on page A42? And what are they telling these allies? And then when you get to the middle of the book, it's actually the end of both books. And it says they just might end up being an ally to you. And you flip it over, you just might end up being an ally to them. And so it really gets at the fact that allyship is fluid. And I think a lot about my former business partner. She's a Black woman. And when people look at us, they think, oh, Victoria must be the ally because she's the white woman. But Certrice has been my ally in so many other situations. You know, she was my mental health ally, my motherhood ally. She's not a mom. I am. Whenever my dad passed away, she was my grieving ally. You know, she was able to take over work and let me take some time off. When I had cancer, she was my health ally, you know, and she was able to hold down the business while I had to get my treatments. So allyship really isn't a one-way relationship. It goes both ways depending on who's in need at any particular time.
Yeah, that's quite important to have those supportive relationships,
Absolutely.
definitely. Well, Victoria, thank you so much for coming on my podcast. It's been a very interesting discussion.
Yes, thank you for having me.